I'm back. Mr. Clarke's back. I'm going to take a look at 1902, the era of Ronald Wilson Reagan. Some of the key things we'll be doing here is we'll be analyzing Reagan's economic policies as president, look at Reagan's leadership and see how he strengthened the conservative movement, and we'll evaluate the steps taken to address various issues in the 1980s and early 90s. You ever wondered what a congressional bill looks like? There's Ronald Reagan on his ranch he has in California. You see him signing a big piece of legislation. Believe it or not, very few members of Congress, and highly doubtful that President Reagan read through that entire bill. When you think about Reagan, the core nickname for the economic plan or programs of Ronald Reagan were nicknamed Reaganomics. So the first thing we'll do here is kind of think about the key components of Reaganomics. And this is kind of a very similar philosophy that many Republican presidents have had in history. He believes in supply-side economics. He'd like to relax regulations on industry and corporations. Remember, conservative politicians tend to get a lot of support from big businesses, and therefore less regulations on industry and corporations can help the bottom dollar or the profit margin. In a similar fashion, he cut taxes for everyone, especially for the wealthy and corporations. This in turn would make more money available for business investments and job growth. And then the theory would be that the wealth would trickle down to the middle and lower classes, thus the entire economy would be revived. What are some advantages and disadvantages of supply-side economics? And again, this is kind of the core philosophy of the Republican Party. Advantages: the Economic Recovery Act reduced taxes by 23% over 3 years. They deregulated the airlines, communications, and banking industries, cut $40 billion from federal programs. In the economy, by 1983, roughly 2+ years into the Reagan presidency, had finally improved. Disadvantages: initial recession. 1980, the end of the Carter administration through the early part of the Reagan presidency. The number of those living in poverty increased. Federal deficit increased from $79 billion to $221 billion. Kind of hard to believe that, a little over 40 years ago, the federal deficit was $79 billion. Today it's nearly $30 trillion. Additionally, we had the savings and loan crisis, which meant that banks needed to be bailed out. And we'll see this later on in history in contemporary times. 3, what assumptions did supply economics depend on in order for it to work properly? So the assumptions, if you believe in supply-side economics, is this assumes that if taxes are reduced, that people will work harder. It also assumes that this will cause the economy to expand and grow, because if you have a lower tax rate, in order to keep the revenue at a similar amount in the congressional and national treasury, is you need more people working, you need higher wages, you need more things bought and sold within the economy so that the tax revenue can remain for the federal government relatively stable, even at the much lower rate. So let's say you have a 40% rate on taxes, and you have X amount, let's say you have $1 trillion coming in with those taxes, but then you reduce it to 30%, but the economy expands greatly and more people are working, you might actually have a higher amount, maybe 1.2 trillion coming into the economy, even at the lower rate, if the economy really does grow and expand as a supply-side economist might advocate. Additionally, supply-side economics assumes that the wealthy, who are now receiving the biggest portion of the tax cut on a percent basis, may invest in expanding their businesses and thus creating more jobs for those who may not be employed at the time. 4, in an attempt to balance the budget and absorb some of the tax cuts. Where did some of these federal cuts come from? If you look here, back up to number 2. Let's see if I can bold it out for us. So if there's a cut of $40 billion from federal programs, question 4 is looking at where these cuts came from. So Congress slashed billions of dollars from domestic spending. Reagan cut spending on over 200 federal aid programs, such as food stamps, Medicaid, and unemployment compensation, all of which are core programs to help out the less fortunate. Next, we'll look at this little flow chart here comparing supply side and Keynesian economics. One is kind of the conservative side and supply side, and the more liberal side with the Keynesian economic plan. So, problem, you have an economic recession, you have consumer demand for goods and services decreasing, and the nation's factories and businesses reducing their output, resulting in an overall slowing of the economy. So that's what's going on, and here's the 2 solutions. The liberal side of the Keynesian government response, government itself increases spending on goods and services in order to increase demand and encourage output by factories and businesses. So the recovery of the economy comes through government spending. That's the Keynesian or liberal philosophy. The supply side or conservative philosophy, government takes in less money in order to encourage consumer spending as well as consumer saving and investment. Savings and investments are then borrowed by creative entrepreneurs to grow and expand companies, creating new products, services, and additional jobs. As we're looking at this, you can kind of decide which one you would actually favor. And then the result of both plans, hypothetically, of course, employment increases, consumer demand for goods and services increases, and economic output rises, resulting in an overall recovery of the economy. You make the call. Which one do you believe is the best course of action for the country? 5, what Reagan policies were considered business friendly? Reagan reduced taxes on the richest Americans, who are often the business owners. He deregulated businesses, meaning that he removed government controls. He also had an anti-union stance that favored business owners over workers. 6, why did President Reagan oppose government regulation? Reagan felt government regulations interfered with businesses and industry. He wanted to give them more leeway and flexibility. Don't be so intrusive in the practices of businesses. 7 lists some examples of Reagan's deregulation policies, and here's a few for you. He deregulated the airline industries, telecommunications, and banking industries. Okay, let's take a look at this little visual here you have. The 4 pillars of Reaganomics: reduce the growth of government spending, so cut back in government spending, reduce the federal income tax and capital gains tax. Federal income tax is what everybody pays. Capital gains tax is, let's say you sell something or you buy and sell stocks, he wants to cut back on the amount of taxes you have to pay on the gain. Reduce government regulation and control the money supply to reduce inflation. The Economic Recovery Tax Act that was passed in '81 early on in Reagan's presidency. The marginal tax rate cut 23% over 3 years. Reduced the maximum individual tax rate to 50%. Reduced maximum estate tax. Estate tax is what you pay on what you inherit from somebody, from 70 to 50%. And reduced the maximum capital gains tax rate to 20%. You can see inflation. 1980 under Carter, still spiking up under Reagan, but then goes down significantly during 1982 to a much more reasonable rate. 8, explain the savings and loan crisis of the late 1980s. High deficits were plaguing the economy. 1,000 savings and loan banks failed, some because of fraudulent behavior, others because of risky loans. The FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, spent over $200 billion to bail out bank deposits from failed banks. Remember back from our studies of the Great Depression, FDIC was passed to kind of ensure bank deposits so the economy wouldn't collapse if banks failed like it did during the Great Depression. Explain the provisions of the 1983 Social Security Reform Act. This raised the retirement age to 65 and increased payroll contributions to the federal system there. Everybody, if you have your own paycheck, you have the FICA on there, the FICA tax there that contributes into Social Security and Medicare. Reagan's Social Security Reform Act in 1983 did not solve long-term problems of Social Security and its solvency. What problems still exist today? The biggest issue is that when Social Security was created, the life expectancy was much lower, so therefore very few retirees live, decades into collecting Social Security. So if you started collecting Social Security when it was initially passed at age 62 and the average life expectancy was 68, well, the average person, just based on the math, would collect it for 6 years. But if life expectancy goes up to 78 or 80, and now all of a sudden you're collecting it for 16, 18, 20 years, and many people outlive their life expectancy, that puts a bigger strain on the population. Also, too, a lot of seniors who are from the baby boom generation today are now collecting Social Security, and therefore there's putting an additional strain on Social Security. 11 during the 1970s and 80s, American countries could, during the 1970s and 80s, American countries could not sell many electronics to Japan. What can you infer about the tariffs in Japan? The Japanese government had ordered high tariffs on goods coming into Japan. Let's change that to states, and that goes with phrase well. This would make it difficult for American goods to compete with Japanese goods in the Japanese market. 12, are all unions permitted to go on strike? No, certain essential professions are prohibited or outlawed from going on strike. For example, police officers, teachers, air traffic controllers, they cannot legally go on strike. If you think about the rationale behind that, obviously schools are essential personnel. They have to keep the society moving forward. You have parents who are dependent upon their children going to school so they can go to work, and obviously the education of children is key priority in the country. Police keeps streets safe. Air traffic controllers, obviously without them, planes could not take off and land, and the travel across the United States and the world could shut down if air traffic controllers went on strike. So what action did President Reagan take when the air traffic controllers union went on strike? He warned that the air traffic controllers to not go on strike, and after they did, he ordered them all to be fired and replaced. 14, where did Reagan draw his support for his domestic policies from? What voters likely opposed Reagan and his policies? Reagan's followers included business owners and higher earners who favored fewer regulations and taxes. Union members and people on Social Security or other programs likely did not support Reagan. 15, what happened to Ronald Reagan on March 30th, 1981, shortly into his first term? As you can see in the imagery here, a deranged John Hinckley Jr. tried to assassinate President Reagan. He had a crush. He had been sending letters and notes to the movie actress Jodie Foster. She still acts in movies and stuff today, but she was kind of a younger, pretty popular actress here in the 1970s and into the 80s. And he thought that if he assassinated Reagan, that Jodie Foster would then have an interest in him if he accomplished something, internationally, significant, something that would have shocked the world. So he wanted to gain her attention, not realizing that had he assassinated Reagan, he would have spent the rest of his life in prison or would have been executed for the crime, but he couldn't make the connection that killing the president would not necessarily get him a date with Jodie Foster. The bullet lodged in Reagan's rib cage, maybe a couple inches from his heart. He nearly died. And in the aftermath of the assassination attempt, Reagan endured himself to the American public with a lot of quotes coming from his hospital recovery room. For example, he said, "Honey, I forgot to duck," when he was speaking to his wife. When speaking to medical staff, he said, "I hope you are all Republicans," because obviously they're working on him to save his life. So Reagan had a relatively successful first term as president. He was running for re-election in 1984. Who challenged Ronald Reagan in the 1984 presidential election? Former Vice President under Jimmy Carter and Minnesota Senator Walter Mondale. Who did Mondale select as his running mate? This is kind of a historic moment. In hopes of making a big splash, he selected Geraldine Ferraro, pictured on the front of Time magazine here. She was a congressional woman from New York State and the very first female candidate to run on a major party ticket for vice president. We've had two others as females run as vice president, Sarah Palin with John McCain, and of course, current Vice President Harris was elected in 2020. 18 on the campaign trail, Walter Mondale stated, "Mr. Reagan will raise taxes. So will I. He won't tell you. I just did." How do you think this impacted his chances to win the presidency? Not many people are in favor of higher taxes, even if they look at the economy and say, hey, maybe we should really raise taxes. Most people are not in favor of that. What were the results of the 1984 election? Reagan and Bush won in a landslide with 59% of the popular vote and all the electoral votes except for Mondale's home state of Minnesota and the District of Columbia or Washington, D.C. 20, how was Reagan able to win re-election in 1984? Reagan was very charismatic. He enjoyed widespread popularity. He's one of the very last presidents to be kind of uniformly or kind of embraced across the country by red states and blue states, Democrats and Republicans. A lot of Democrats voted for Reagan. President Bush, in his first election in 1988, gained a lot of votes in democratically traditional states as well. In fact, I think 1988 was the last year that the state of New Jersey voted for a Republican, voting for George Herbert, Worker Bush in 88, but ever since, voting Democratic. Also, by 1983, the economy had been rebounding and things were looking better. 21, this is kind of like an overall question as to why choosing a Supreme Court justice is one of the most important decisions a president can make. Well, the first thing you want to think about is how long a Supreme Court justice serves on the court. It's a lifetime appointment. So when you look at a Supreme Court justice, they may serve for decades, long after a president's out of office, long after a president's deceased. So President Reagan's going to appoint justices who are going to serve for a long period of time. What qualifications did Reagan seek in a Supreme Court justice? He wanted justices who would follow the original intent and wording of the Constitution, not legislate from the bench and create new laws or rules, regulations, things like that. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the Reagan presidency involved the federal Supreme Court. How did he impact the Supreme Court? He appointed the very first female member of the Supreme Court, which is important to know. Pictured in the center, Sandra Day O'Connor. Antonin Scalia on the left, long-serving justice. And Anthony Kennedy were all justices that he appointed. Scalia and Kennedy served until very recently. Kennedy retired. Scalia died on the Supreme Court. And then the Rehnquist Court. In addition, when the former Chief Justice Warren Burger retired, Reagan replaced him with the most conservative member of the Supreme Court, William Rehnquist, pictured on the right. How did the philosophy of the Supreme Court evolve during the 80s? Unlike previous courts that were quite active, this court favored judicial restraint. The court handed down decisions that curtailed affirmative action and limited the rights of criminal suspects. And 5, explain how George Herbert Walker Bush benefited from Reagan's popular presidency. What drawbacks did some conservatives have about George Herbert Walker Bush? Bush benefited from Reagan's support, the fact that he was a really popular president. He wanted to continue many of Reagan's policies and vowed not to raise taxes. However, some conservatives were doubtful as to whether or not he was committed to the conservative causes that Reagan had championed. Next, we're going to finish up with kind of a little cultural look at the 1980s. You may have heard the term, who were the yuppies? Yup. They were the young urban professionals, very ambitious and hardworking business people of the 1980s. So yuppie stands for young, urban professionals. And for the plural it out, they put the pie at the end there for yuppie. Now you can see here on the left, the gentleman holding the earliest cell phone. It was nicknamed the Brick. They had the yuppie handbook here. They had the fancy suit. They played like a racquetball or squash. The woman wore the power business suit. You had the leather briefcase. Often, if you were wealthy, you'd have your own private or Lear jet. You would have status symbol cars like a BMW. Here's one. You know him. You may not love him. Donald J. Trump. Explain the meaning of this quote from Donald Trump in 1980. Trump stated, I don't do it for the money. I've got enough, more than I'll ever need. I do it to do it. Deals are my art form. Other people paint beautifully on canvas or write wonderful poetry. I like making deals, preferably big deals. And he made the biggest deal of all time, winning the presidency in 2016. He wrote the book, The Art of the Deal. You see him pictured here. 28, what advances happened during the 1980s because of the space program? And of course, the space program's chief goal initially was to put the first person on the moon, but they did develop a wide variety of different products and items and things like that. So NASA technology contributed to many everyday items, including tires, vacuum cleaners, firefighting gear. The very first space shuttle was launched in April 1981, the Space Shuttle Columbia. That's what a space shuttle looks like, pictured here in the imagery down below. 29, what happened to the Space Shuttle Challenger in January 1986? Defective seals in the solid rocket boosters allowed combustible gas to ignite, and just minutes after taking off, it exploded. Krista McAuliffe, pictured here in the top center. She was a teacher who won a contest. Everybody had to kind of write in for an application, and they wanted to be the first educator into space. And she was the big winner, but obviously it was in the end not necessarily a win because she lost her life. The 7-member crew aboard this one here, which is Space Shuttle Challenger, took off. Here you can see the fire behind and then the explosion shortly thereafter as the nation looked on in horror as the Challenger exploded. In one challenge during Reagan's presidency, explained how he could have handled his challenge better. During his presidency, Reagan was very slow to respond to the AIDS epidemic. Had he funneled more government funds into the AIDS research and education right away, many lives could have potentially been saved. And then lastly, the lesson reflection, what were some of the most interesting developments and changes of the 1980s? This is an opinion question. The Sony Walkman played cassette tapes, pictured bottom left. VCRs played movies on home TVs. Cable and satellite television expanded. There's an early cable box on the right. It wasn't digital. You had to actually do a little slide to the left and right there to actually do it. The popular video game system Atari debuted in the 1980s, which I had, of course. Benefit concerts during this period of time. 1984 Band Aid, which helped starving people in Ethiopia. Live Aid, watched in over 100 nations, and they recorded the song We Are the World, which raised millions of dollars for the impoverished. Hopefully you enjoyed our discussion of the 1980s. And until next time, Mr. Clarke is out.